Hi everyone, I'm Allison Hazell, and welcome to Eat, Move, Think. I'm really excited today to have the genetics team back together. Welcome Jess, welcome Justin.
Hi, thank you for having us again.
Thank you very much.
And I'm also really pleased to say that we are joined by Medcan's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Peter Nord. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And excited that you're going to be joining us for the first half of this discussion on our whole genome sequencing program. So, to set the stage a little bit, last year we introduced whole genome sequencing into our product portfolio. And essentially it was a pretty big milestone moment for Medcan in that we, for the first time in Canada actually, were able to offer a clinical, healthy whole genome sequence to Medcan clients, and we created it in conjunction with the annual health assessment. So by taking someone's whole genome sequence and all of the clinical information they get from the health assessment, really giving people the most in-depth kind of clinical view of their health available. And now that we're 1 year in, we wanted to take a step back and look at kind of how it's gone the past year, what we've learned, what we're hearing from our clients, and kind of what our plans are for the future. So thank you everyone for joining me for this episode. So I think we'll maybe start with Dr. Nord. You had your genome sequenced as part of this program. And,
I did, yeah.
And I thought it'd be interesting for our listeners to kind of hear a little bit about your experience and what it was like for you going through that process.
Yeah, well, I was really excited to be a guinea pig. Guinea pig, one of the first two. I think I was number 2, wasn't I? Yes. And at the front end, it's very, very simple. It's just collecting some samples. So it was a little anticlimactic. I was super excited. Get the samples taken, and then you wait. And then I got the call from Justin that the material was in, and he was going to go over things with me. And so for me, it's been great because I've had the experience as a patient going through it. But I've also had the experience of being a physician and getting this information, like working with a patient who's had this done. So I've seen it from both sides. So it's been, from the patient's perspective, I guess one of the themes is super easy. You don't have to do much. But the back end of it, and I think this is one of the values that we really bring, it isn't just a data dump. Like Justin was amazing at framing a ton of data, but framing it in a way that was utilized, that I could actually digest in a way. And I think that's one of the things that we bring that other organizations that are doing some of this work may not be able to provide, that clinical context, the kind of the real world information that comes out of this data. So it's sort of turning data into information, and then turning information into knowledge. And then what does that mean? And what does it mean for yourself? But what does it mean for your family? What does it mean for your kids or their kids in terms of, what things are going to get passed on, which things aren't going to get passed on? And there's so many sub-chapters in the whole genome sequence that I wasn't expecting. So I think we probably spent about an hour or so. And I know this. Basically, I know the science behind it, but even then, it was great to have the discussion and kind of work through what this really means. And we found some stuff too. I had a couple of mutations that raised my risk for a couple of conditions, and so nothing earth-shattering, but boy, it was super informational for me in terms of what can I do in terms of modifying my own behavior, my health risks into the future. So if I think, oh gosh, I'm a little bit more susceptible to getting this condition, what can I do now to make sure that I can push that off and hopefully it never actually becomes reality? Because you're comparing, my data, my results against population, and the population is a bell curve. And I've talked about this on previous podcasts, like the bell curve, and we don't know necessarily where an individual is going to be placed on that bell curve. I might be average, or I might be somewhere down the tails of the bell curve. So it was great. And I actually wrote down like the sub-chapters. I'm not sure if we're going to talk about it, but for me it was really interesting. Like medical conditions, carrier states, common conditions, pharmacogenomic information, which is super helpful on the physician side as well, relevance to the family, implications for family members, and then screening recommendations. And I think that's where, again, we're turning raw data into something that's actually actionable and making a difference, again, not just for me, but for my family. And as a physician with patients that are coming in with this, specifically that pharmacogenomic information is going to probably help me to prescribe medications that I know now are more likely to work better in somebody, where I could choose another medication and, it's just not going to work quite as well. And that's genetically driven. So even from the physician's perspective, this is the beginning of a new world. When we talk about precision medicine and personalized healthcare, but we start to put in all the biomarker results that we get through the annual health assessment, and you marry that with the information from whole genome sequencing, you're getting such specific information. Now you're not dealing with kind of a bell curve of population health. You're dealing with something that's pretty specific to Peter Nord. And that's the future of healthcare, where we're customizing treatments directly to that person. And it's something that I'm super excited about, because Medcan is one of the few organizations in Canada, probably North America, that we can not only come up with all of this very personalized information, we can actually create the solutions within our ecosystem to make sure that we minimize risks and improve wellness and health. So super excited. And I know you're going to talk about the results, but the results have been more than I think anybody would have thought. So super exciting.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear that you had a kind of good experience with it. And I think you were one of the guinea pigs. Part of the reason why we started with some of our kind of internal providers was also for the genetic counseling team to get some experience doing this as well. So I think generally with whole genome sequencing, there's a little bit of a fear factor, and you're going to get a wave of data at you, and how are you going to handle it? So it's great to hear that your experience was positive. I'd be curious to see, Justin and Jess are here, in terms of your experience delivering this information. Has it been kind of what you expected? Has there been any learning over the year that you've been doing this now?
I would say huge learnings, right? So probably in the same experience that you had with Justin, with some of our guinea pigs per se, as genetic counselors, we were able to practice explaining whole genome sequencing in layman's terms to clients. Well, they are physicians like yourself in the guinea pig practice setting, but for us, it helped us figure out what ways to explain information made most sense, and what was the best received, and how we can do this in a way that is clear but isn't taking a ton of time, right? When clients come for their health assessment, they're here for 5 hours. We don't need to add another hour to that. So for me, I've found myself adjusting the way I explain whole genome sequencing as I better understand it myself, and as I see how clients react to the information. On the flip side, when we give results, that's been a really wonderful learning curve as well. Coming into this having no idea what to expect. Are we going to find terrible amounts of bad news for everyone? Are we going to have too much data to be able to process? Are people going to understand it? These were some of the questions I had, but I'm finding that the way we're able to explain the data, to break it down into the sections that you mentioned, Dr. Nord, I find the clients extremely receptive, extremely appreciative, and the time that we spend with them, that dedicated 30 to 60 minutes or so, clients really find that they come away with a really good understanding of what their genome sequencing was able to tell us. Mm-hmm. What about you, Justin?
Yeah. I think Sick Kids has done a very good job in their reporting as well. And so with, kind of, as you said, distilling the whole genome into a report, into a few pages, it seems like a pretty overwhelming task. And that was kind of my first thought, was how are we going to do this? But the reporting is really good. When it comes to pharmacogenomic results, we do that here at Medcan. When it comes to looking at medically actionable genetic conditions, we do that here at Medcan. Carrier status, we do that here at Medcan. So those things I was confident in, but common conditions and then the non-actionable stuff, that was a huge learning curve. So the anticipation of that, and then being able to relay that information, I think it was, as for anything that we do when we take on something new in the field of genetic counseling, it was a bit of a learning curve, but how neat to be able to practice those skills, and how neat for to see that those concepts being relayed and kind of better understood person after person. So yeah, it's a very unique counseling situation. We have to tackle a lot, but with that anticipatory counseling, people know that they're going to get this, these degrees of information. They almost come into the sessions, even though it's been a few months afterwards, saying, okay, great, we did the medical stuff. What about the common conditions? And so they almost know what's coming up next, even without seeing the report beforehand, because I feel like it's even impactful for people.
Yeah.
They kind of see that breakdown as well.
So that's actually a really good segue, because I do kind of want to take a step back for listeners just to kind of understand how we have the program set up or how it's laid out. So I don't know, Jess, if you can kind of give a quick overview of the kind of client journey, I guess, through whole genome sequencing at Medcan.
Yeah, for sure. So to date, most of our clients that have done whole genome sequencing have done it as part of their health assessment. So they come in for their health assessment. There's a blood draw that's part of that. And during that blood draw, we take an extra sample of blood for whole genome sequencing. But that client during their day will sit down with genetic counselor and learn all about whole genome sequencing. So that includes, what kind of results we might find, what are the potential benefits of the testing, not just to that client, but to their biological family members. What are some of the limitations of the testing? There's no test that's perfect, and whole genome sequencing is especially limited, like any test, by our knowledge and our technology. And really understand where their data is going, how it's being used, how it can be translated into actionable or at least helpful risk information, and help them decide if whole genome sequencing is the right fit for whatever they're looking for during their journey. If everything sounds good, we go through the Sick Kids consent form together. Their blood sample takes a short trip up University Avenue to Sick Kids' Genome Diagnostics Lab, and then about 4 months later, we sit down again, although usually virtually, and we go through the results. We always try and foster continuity of care, so the same genetic counselor that saw the client initially will see the client again. They know their story, they understand their results, and it's about helping that client really understand all of that data, what it means for them, and help them use that health risk information to take charge of their health.
Thank you. That's a good comprehensive overview. I think one of the things I want to point out, and I think I'm quite proud of that we have set it up this way, is that opportunity to speak to a genetic counselor before you go through the process. And I think the field generally, there's sort of a trend moving away from this kind of pre-test genetic counseling, and you just deal with it on the back end. And we've thought about that over the years, but with this program specifically, and actually we've kept it for all of our programs for a number of different reasons, but for this program specifically, I think it's a really big value add for clients. And we do have people who say, yes, I want to do this, and then they speak with a genetic counselor and they actually say, you know what, this isn't what is good for me at this particular point in time. I'm going to do this test instead. So I think that's an important piece of our program, and I think we're seeing it on the back end that people kind of value that as well. So Dr. Nord, in sort of the different sections that you outlined, you did touch on applicability to family members, and I'm curious if your family knew you were doing this testing, kind of what their reaction was to it and what that experience was like.
Yeah, they did, because I was chatting it up I was pretty excited. and again, they probably forgot after 3 months. And so after going through and getting all the results and understanding it, and specifically that section around impact on family members. So I have 3 boys. They're 25, 27, and 29. 29-year-old just got married. So you start to think about these life transition points. And they are all coming. 2 have come in for, I think, their baseline AHA, and the 3rd one's coming in about a month from now. So they've sort of drunk the Medcan Kool-Aid at this point, just in terms of general, being early, making sure, because, cholesterol, even something as simple as cholesterol, that starts to pop up in late 20s, early 30s, and that's when you actually want to get in there and make a difference. So based on that, I said, like, hey, I got these results, and kind of went through some of the implications for them. And so, they're 3 guys in their 20s. So they were playing it pretty cool. But I knew they were sort of taking it in and kind of processing, what does that really mean for me? And a little bit of genetics 101 about Mendelian, transmission of genes. And so they were very interested to the point where I think at some point, and this is I think we may have some other people doing this, but I probably will gift this to them. Like if, as opposed to, giving them, here's a Christmas present, like whole genome sequencing, because, especially 29-year-old just got married, they're going to have kids. What's the effect, on their kids even? So it just goes down sort of generation after generation. So they're very interested. And I think I'm looking forward to taking it really to the next level as we, and then actually it'd be interesting to compare like my result to their results and see like what actually did transmit down and what didn't. So I think it's kind of interesting, and it is one of those things that does impact your whole family. And so at some point, and I think there's a point in the report that says, you may want to have your children, at some point tested for some of these things as well to see, are they at risk as well?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. We really appreciate it. I know you have other places to get to, but thank you for stopping by and sharing your perspective.
Great. Thanks. Again, really exciting times. Can't say it enough.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So setting the stage a little bit, Justin, I'm going to put you on the spot right now and ask you to give a little bit of an overview of what whole genome sequencing is on kind of broad strokes so that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're actually talking about when we use those words.
Yeah, okay. So the human genome is basically all of our genetic information. You made an analogy once in the past podcast about it being like looking at a map. And what the whole genome does is it provides the map. And some of the details about, bigger cities, we have a lot of insight into. But when we start looking at these kind of secondary roads and getting into these smaller cities, although the map is there, we may not have cataloged those areas of the map as well. I make an analogy of the human genome being like a huge library. There's about 20,000 genes that make humans humans, and there's all this little space in between. And so whole genome sequencing basically reads through those genes, looks at that space, and it translates the information in those books, but we can't necessarily read all of those books. We just have insight into a certain chunk of those books. And so whole genome sequencing is basically reading through the entire library of genes or books that make people people. And I mean, in comparison to things like other kind of companies that analyze genetic information, but maybe not to the whole extent, what they sometimes do is just flip open a few books, look at a few pages and see if there's any genetic changes in those pages. So it's by no means comprehensive, but it looks at pages and books throughout the genome, but it's not reading through each book line by line, page by page. It's just flipping through little bits and pieces to pull out small little bits of information. So when we do whole genome sequencing, it's a little more comprehensive. It's a clinical test, and it gives us clinical insight into a person's genetic information.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, so now that we're a year into this program, I'm curious what types of clients and people you're seeing opting in to wanting this type of information and wanting this test.
It's a really good question. I think there are, in my own experience, at least in talking to clients about this testing, there are a few attributes that most clients will have. First, they're not health anxious. So they're not concerned about being told they may have an increased risk for certain health conditions. They're not bothered by that possibility. In fact, they're seeking out that possibility. They're specifically saying, why wouldn't I want that information? I want to be able to plan out my life, manage those risks, know what those risks are. So that's a really important piece for whole genome sequencing, specifically since we have non-actionable risks. And then I find that clients that are interested in whole genome sequencing are also ones that are really interested in the most advanced technology and testing that is currently available. They're often really interested in the fact that this was a test developed by Medcan in conjunction with Sick Kids, which is a well-known institution with its own genetics lab. And they're individuals who are trying to be as comprehensive as possible about their health risk information. So in my experience, those are the attributes I see in most of the clients that I speak to. What about you, Justin?
Yeah, no, I think that you hit the nail on the head with those two cases. Recently, I saw someone who was adopted and just wants to know any piece of information that they can. because family history is a really important part of our healthcare. And when you lack that, getting any kind of bit or piece was helpful. But I agree, people who are interested in knowing as much about themselves as they can, and people who maybe perceive risk in a way that where they're willing to hear anything, even if it could potentially be bad news. And for these non-actionable conditions, some people say, well, listen, what if there is a research study that pops out within the next 5 years? At least this is on my radar, and now I know that I can enroll myself because I have some kind of a genetic predisposition that I otherwise would have been oblivious to. So some people are, already thinking about ways that they may be able to modify their risk, even if there is something that's inactionable.
So we've referenced actionable and non-actionable a couple of times. So maybe can you provide your definition of how you think about that, or how we think about those things at Medcan, just so we're speaking the same language?
Yeah, so I tell people very clearly, if there's a genetic change, I call these genetic mutations. They're also called pathogenic variants, or likely pathogenic variants. If that's identified in a gene that's actionable, then I can refer that person off to a healthcare provider who will follow them for any risk that might be connected to that genetic mutation.
So there's like an action that can be taken from that information in terms of medical screening or something like that.
Exactly. And so a healthcare provider says, oh, okay, yeah, there's this, we can do something about this. I like to focus on the cancer part because that's my bread and butter. But if someone was found to have a gene mutation that increases risk for, let's say, colon cancer, then we can refer them off to a gastroenterologist who would be doing more frequent colon screening. There's also programs like the at Mount Sinai Hospital, where there's registries where patients with these genetic predispositions can find community and look at other kind of risks for cancer. The other kind of context being a non-actionable gene mutation. If we find that there's a pathogenic variant or a mutation in one of these genes, there is no healthcare provider who would follow that person for that genetic condition. And so even if we look at something like a gene that might be increasing risk for Parkinson's, I'm not aware of any clinic that would follow people with a genetic predisposition to Parkinson's. It's only when that person may become symptomatic that they would then be followed. And so people may say, well, listen, why would I ever want to learn that information if I'm just waiting to become symptomatic? Particularly in some of these genes, it may never happen. And someone may wait their entire life to be symptomatic. And so the health-seeking person versus the person who might be a little bit more health anxious, it really separates that. And sometimes we have couples who come in. One person of that couple is like, yeah, I want to hear it all. And the other person says, maybe I'll just opt for just the actionable stuff. And we have a different kind of conversation. So that's how I define the two.
Yeah. I would add, if I may, too, that action today, it doesn't mean we can fix this mutation, right? That's not the action that we're taking. The action is that there's something we can do to manage that risk, be it through risk reduction or increased screening for early detection. And the definition of which genes are actionable versus non-actionable will very likely change over time, because as screening gets better, as treatment and cures are invented, something that may not be actionable today could become actionable tomorrow. So that's an important consideration as well when we talk to our clients about whole genome sequencing, is that non-actionable is just a definition for right now. And the hope is that something non-actionable could become actionable.
Okay, so then looking at the data in terms of all of the clients that we've seen so far, and as Dr. Nord had mentioned, our response to this testing has been greater actually than we anticipated. I think, we didn't know how many people were going to want to opt into this information. We've had higher demand, I think, than we had anticipated. If we look at all of the individuals who've gone through the testing, what types of results are we finding? Kind of what's the data showing in terms of likelihood that we're going to find a mutation of one type or the other?
Yeah, so if I reference the categories that Dr. Nord mentioned, so first is medical conditions. These can be actionable and non-actionable medical risks. We are seeing about 50% of clients that do this testing have some sort of personal medical risk identified, and some have more than one. So I think one one or two people have had 3 mutations in that category identified. For carrier status, which is more for family planning or risks for relatives to be aware of, we are seeing that about 96% of clients that have done this have at least one carrier status risk identified, but the range is up to 7. For common conditions, by definition, they're common. These are genetic variants where they might very slightly increase your risk. It's not meant to change your medical management. There are some lifestyle strategies actually that can modify your common risk and change your position on the bell curve, like Dr. Nord said. Everyone has common condition risks, and that's what we expected when we did this testing. And then for that last section, which is the pharmacogenomic information, we're focusing on medications where there are clear genotype-specific dosing guidelines. So these genes result in a clear recommendation for your dosing for these medications, and we're seeing that almost 80% of clients will have some sort of significant dosing recommendation for a medication that they could take in the future come out of this testing. So it's been really interesting to see these results since we had almost no context as to what to expect.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. Have you had any surprises in terms of the interactions with clients or types of results that you're getting, or any cases that kind of stand out to you?
Yeah, I think so. One interesting thing about whole genome sequencing for me is that this type of testing kind of really hammers in some of the complexity of genetic results. And so oftentimes we hear about these conditions that are dominant, where we have 2 copies of every gene. If you have a mutation in one copy, that's enough for that person to be at increased risk or get a medical condition. And then there's these recessive conditions where you have to have a mutation in both copies of that gene in order for that person to manifest a condition. But I'm picking up more and more of people who are carriers for a condition that is typically recessive. You need to have mutation in both copies, but they just have mutation in one copy, and they may develop some mild symptoms of that condition. And it kind of, when you practice clinically, these things do pop up with certain conditions, but the frequency with which they're popping up in whole genome is alarming and not alarming, interesting. And some of these conditions are could be relatively common, and something just like having dry skin as being a carrier for this condition, where if you actually had the condition, there's some pretty significant issues with skin.
There's another one with missing teeth too that we're seeing a lot of.
Yeah. So it's kind of this neat thing where maybe some things that people could dismiss throughout their life, this test might be able to pick up. And so there was one example of another condition where this thing happened, and someone said, oh, you know what? I actually have a finding through another test that my specialist said, this is pretty unusual. And now he's going to go back to that specialist and say, hey, this genetic finding, maybe we need to do a little more monitoring of this. And so maybe being able to pick up these small nuanced health issues that otherwise never had any real explanation, and we are okay with that because there's lots of things that happen in our health that have no explanation, and that's fine. But if we can tie in some kind of an interesting medical genetic finding to that, I think that's for me one of the more surprising aspects.
Oh yeah, it's super interesting.
Mine is actually the opposite of what Justin is saying. Going into this, I figured we would pick up interesting tidbits about anyone who did this testing. And now I mentioned everyone has common condition risks, but I've had now one client who had 0 mutations for a medical condition risk and 0 mutations for a carrier status risk. And I couldn't get over it. I thought that person must be, incredibly genetically blessed. And I told that person that I thought that because we're looking at 4,000 genes in today's iteration of this testing. We're not finding that much all of the time. But I think this goes to show that genetics is only a piece of our health puzzle. There's so much else that plays a role, and very important roles in our health. So it's so interesting that Justin's talked about how many little things we're finding, and I'm thinking about how some people have nothing to be found.
Yeah. And so, going into this, you would have assumed that wouldn't there wouldn't be anybody who wouldn't have either a carrier.
I would have
carrier
assumed that
risk
there was no chance of
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you learn that in school. Everybody's a carrier for 7 to 12
Yeah,
conditions or whatever.
I say 5 to 6.
Yeah.
So just make everyone feel okay when that
Yeah.
happens. Like, we just know a few of the ones that you're a carrier
Yeah.
for now. But yeah, it's like that one person. Maybe I tell people sometimes that they just were set up for success by
Yes,
their
genetically
parents.
set up for success. The rest is up to them.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll ask a forward-looking question because we've been focusing on the past year. But what are you both excited about in terms of future applications of whole genome sequencing in this program or kind of more broadly? Is there anything that's on your mind?
I have two things that I'm excited about. So one is I don't know that people always realize how little of the genome we actually understand. We understand maybe about 1% of the genome. So one thing I'm really excited about is the ability to revisit the sequence that exists and be able to analyze it as we understand certain regions or new genes are characterized. And I think that is the best part of whole genome sequencing, is that we don't have to do the test again. The sequence is there, the data is there, we just can interpret it now. So I'm really excited to see how future iterations and future versions of this testing will look. I have no way to predict when they'll be available, but I'm excited for that possibility. And the other thing I'm excited for is to see what this brings, not just for our clients and for Medcan, but for the world of genetics. Being able to offer this kind of whole genome sequencing program to individuals who are generally healthy means that we can probably give a lot of really important data back to the world that will help us understand certain genes that maybe we thought were rare, but like Justin said, are actually really common. Maybe it'll change our perspective of certain conditions or certain genes, or the way we expect our genome to look. And I'm excited to see how that changes as we move forward.
Yeah, I think from the aspects of the testing and those the 5 categories that we look at, the common conditions I think is really interesting. Mm-hmm. And so now that more people are getting their genomes sequenced, and particularly people who are have a medical condition and are getting their genome sequenced, for them, if we can get enough data on what makes genetically these people similar, we can start looking at small bits of their genome that they may have in common and start thinking, hey, is there an association between these minor genetic changes between this population of people? And if so, how many of those little genetic changes does someone who's healthy have? And can we help predict whether or not they may be at risk for those things as well? These are called genome-wide association studies. And the more insight that we can get, we can help maybe predict what could be on people's radar in maybe a more subtle way. But I can hear a lot of people asking, hey, can you tell me about this or this, or what's my risk for an autoimmune condition? And we don't know what the genes are connected to that, but maybe things like these genome-wide association studies could give us more insight in the future. Mm-hmm. I'm excited to see where that expands. Yeah. I know we're probably a little bit away from that, but I think that's kind of a cool piece of technology that we can use in the future.
I'm really excited about, because I'm working on it right now actually, is opening this up to more individuals. So I think when we started this program a year ago, we built it into the annual health assessment for a reason. We wanted to make sure that we were kind of taking baby steps, doing these things well, making sure we were able to do this well and be responsible with how we were doing it. And a year in, I think we're at the point now where we can start to offer this more broadly. And so people who are interested in just seeking out whole genome sequencing as a standalone test is something that it's going to be available very soon. So I'm really excited about that and bringing this information and knowledge and kind of the data that we can get from this to kind of a wider audience. Yeah, so I think, we are a year into offering this program, but it does kind of feel like we're just at the beginning. I think there's a lot of new opportunities and new pieces of the genome that we're going to continue to kind of interpret and give back to clients over time. So I'm really thankful for both of you for coming today and sharing your experience and your perspective. So thank you, Jess, and thank you, Justin, and maybe we'll see you here next year.
Sounds good. Thank you, and I can't wait to see what we talk about in a year.
Yeah, I'm really excited.